Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Okay, so this is Asia Tech Podcast Stories. My name is Graham Brown. We are all about the stories behind the Asian tech ecosystem, the people that make this one of the most exciting, one of the most fascinating, and the fastest moving ecosystem in the world. To share their stories today, I've got two guys, Don, Phan, Adrian, Latortue from Embe. We're going to talk about their business, how they got into that, and also how they ended up where they are today. And I don't say ended up. It's maybe part of a bigger journey in their life. So we'll find out a bit more about that. Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Graham, for the kind introduction.
Well, it's great to have you here. Ho Chi Minh City is one of my favorite cities in Southeast Asia. How long have you guys been there? Personally, not the business, but how long have you been there?
So I've been here, this is Adrian speaking, I've been here for about 7 years. My first time here was about 10 years ago now, but the last 7 years kind of working in tech and e-commerce.
Mm-hmm. And I've been in, well, we call it Saigon. I've been here for about 8 years. This is my third time living here. And like Adrian, off and on for the last decade, but third time living here full time. Right.
So you've collectively been there around about 15 years, but even in the last 7 or 8 years, there must have been phenomenal changes in Saigon, right? You know, what has changed that now that if you were to step out your house today and walk around, what's kind of different about Saigon today than it was when you arrived 7 or 8 years ago?
Smartphones. Yeah, smartphones. Everyone's addicted to like a mobile device in some way. Consumer culture has definitely grown a lot. I think, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, if you were looking for different kinds of like F&B brands, they really wouldn't have them, or consumer products. Those are just kind of emerging on the market, and now they're everywhere. So it's a market that moves pretty quickly in that regard.
Mm-hmm. What about in terms of foreigners being there? In terms of people, because I know Saigon now is a real popular hotspot for people, whether it's drop shipping or e-commerce and so on. A lot of people have moved to Saigon as a choice, right? For, they can get access to a reasonably large domestic market. They get access to a lot of skilled talent, and they're geographically in a great position as well. They're sort of at that perch. They can get all of Southeast Asia and China as well. Are you seeing that around you in terms of sort of people moving to Saigon and making it their base? Is that sort of happening at a rapid rate?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty big expat hub, and the quality of life here is good and affordable. So, we see people from all over the world move here. And Saigon is historically a big trading port city.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes sense for somebody like you, Don, I can understand, because you have the Vietnamese heritage. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to come to your story. But first, Adrian, there's not an obvious connection. How did you end up in Vietnam? Because, you're from the States originally. You told me off air that you have a Haitian background. How did you end up there?
So I guess the short story is, I was in university, and this was 10 years ago. I decided to come during the summer, and I volunteered teaching English at a university. Totally fell in love with it, was taking Vietnamese language at the time in university. And then, every time I decided to keep coming back year after year. And every time I kept coming back, it kept getting better and better. And so, back in 2012, when I decided to make the move here to actually work, I was pretty sure that I was going to stay here kind of more or less full time to kind of seek out the opportunities here, and especially as the market kept growing.
What was it about Vietnam that connected with you? I mean, I imagine a lot of people, your generation, that sort of time, they were doing Chiang Mai or maybe Bangkok, or even, some people, if they wanted a more corporate life, would move to Singapore, or if they were in finance, Hong Kong. Why did you choose Vietnam?
I guess one of the initial reasons I chose Vietnam was, one, I had a lot of Vietnamese friends that I grew up with back in Connecticut, but also when I first came here, nobody was really coming to Vietnam. It's just kind of this country in Southeast Asia that no one really talked about. also, everyone wanted to be in China or Thailand, right? Or talk about Indonesia. And then when I came here, I just saw that, there's a lot of hustle in the streets. There's a lot going on. You kind of really have to stay and start seeking it out. And the fact that it was difficult back then meant that not your average person would come here, right? And so they had to have, a certain sense of like resilience and an idea of like what they're going to do here that would keep them here long term. And with some of the other places like China, the United States has over 100-year history of trade with China, and so a lot of those paths are already carved out. And so there's institutions, whether it be foreign institutions or domestic institutions, that were like already catering to that.
So what you're saying that the entrepreneurs that came to Vietnam were tougher, maybe more focused, and had a better idea of what they wanted to achieve. No, or is that what you're kind of saying? Because it's a tougher environment, right?
I think it's a tougher environment because no one's really at that point had really figured it out, right? In terms of like foreigners, and so that appeal kind of coming to this wide open market where no one's really here. No one's like, hey, I'm studying Vietnamese and I really plan on setting up operations here. That's what made it difficult, and so it sounded like the ideal place, right?
Studying Vietnamese. I want to talk about that before I go back to Don. How's your Vietnamese, Adrian?
I guess it's enough to read contracts and do negotiations and host a TV show.
Okay. That's pretty much enough, right? I mean, okay, you might not be native level fluent, but you're fluent, right? I mean, if you can read contracts and negotiate and host a TV show, that's pretty much everything you need.
Well, part of our deal, too, is that Adrian was supposed to run the staff meetings in Vietnamese, and that's what we do.
So that's pretty cool. What about yourself, Don? I mean, you are obviously from Vietnamese background. Were you born in Vietnam? Were you born in the States? Tell us a little about your story and how you connected with Vietnam.
I was born and raised in the U.S. I grew up in Louisiana. And like Adrian, I started studying Vietnamese in college. We actually had the same instructor. And I started coming back when I took a gap year between my sophomore and junior year, and I spent a semester here. And I fell in love with it, and I came back on a graduate fellowship. I met my wife near the end of the graduate fellowship, and I came back in 2012 with Rocket Internet. We started an online fashion company called Zalora, and around this time I had actually asked Adrian to come back. So Adrian and I had worked together on this venture before, and so we've been plying our trade with trying to develop e-commerce in Vietnam for years now, since 2012. And in the meantime, we've learned a lot about e-commerce, online marketing, and sourcing. And so that we thought that we could use those skills to sell globally.
Right. Did you come to Vietnam with Zalora originally, or with Rocket Internet, obviously?
It was with Rocket Internet, and Zalora had a different working name at the time. We were thinking about using the name Zalandi, but then headquarters decided to use the name Zalora for the entire group, and Zalandi ended up becoming one of our private label brands. We got a lot of experience meeting suppliers here, and Vietnam is one of the countries in the world that's like the factory of the world. So we're within an hour drive from a lot of these huge factories.
So you went from Zalora to FoodPanda, was it, after that? So I mean, that was another Rocket Internet, well, originally owned by Rocket Internet, but they sold it off to Delivery Hero, was it? Yeah,
Rocket, I think also has a major stake in Delivery Hero too. So I'm not sure what the corporate structure looks like, but Rocket's behind there somehow.
Right. So you were part of this Rocket Internet family, and there was some point in which you decided you want to go and do your own thing, right? Which is the setting up of this company, which you guys both run now. So tell us a little bit about the story behind that. How did that come about, Embe?
Sure. So around this time, I'd been with Rocket for over 2 years, and I knew that I had learned a lot, and I wanted to push myself and take on another challenge. And I was looking around Vietnam to see where the opportunities were. And our former boss, Oliver Samwer from Rocket Internet, his bread and butter is cloning companies that have worked in the U.S. So I was trying to apply that kind of thinking and logic to Vietnam, and I thought that Vietnam's young demographics would be perfect. There are a lot of babies born every year, about like 1.5 million, and it's a super young country. Most of the population is under 30, 64% is under 35. And you just walk around, you'll see babies and smartphones everywhere. And so we thought, okay, baby e-commerce is something that we want to get into. And it was something that I thought would be something that I could handle within my own skills. When I started the company, I actually hadn't had a baby yet, but I'd been thinking about babies a lot. And now I have a 2-year-old baby boy. And when we started, I didn't know very much about baby products. I knew a little bit, but we learned a lot from one of our buying partners who helped us start the company. And I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and we know quite a bit about, sourcing baby products from suppliers here in Vietnam. And it helps that, I've grown up in the U.S. and I've spent time here, so we get more of a global perspective on what the trends are and how we can use our relationships to get good products at pretty good prices.
Right, but with your background and your experience, why did you choose to sell baby products? I mean, why did you choose to get into that industry? I know you just threw some data out there about the demographics, but, having worked in Zalora, having worked in FoodPanda, you could have chosen anything you wanted to sell, right?
Right. I guess I sometimes tell people it was probably my biological clock ticking. I was thinking about babies a lot and seeing a lot of babies. So, part of it was like top-down thinking, like, okay, the numbers are big, the market size is probably big enough, and the market's going to be growing. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for baby products, a lot of opportunity for e-commerce. So let's try to do both. And then just, my own personal thinking about babies a lot.
Scratching your own itch.
Right.
But obviously, you grew up in the States, and you are selling baby products to Vietnamese consumers, but I know that you have a sensitivity to the Vietnamese consumers. You've lived there long enough, you have the heritage and so on. Do you ever find that that is enough to really understand them? Do you feel like you understand the Vietnamese consumers really well now, or are you still sort of constantly challenged? Do you find there are examples like pop up on a daily basis where you think, oh well, a little bit of a culture shock there, I didn't expect that, or that's kind of there's my American thinking again. Caught me out.
A lot of this just comes in with clothing designs, like things that wouldn't do well in the U.S. do well here. There'll be really random assortment of design combinations. Like there'll be like a horse with flowers or like a rhino with flowers, and that wouldn't match. Like you wouldn't see this in a U.S. baby store, but you'll see here. And those are the items that I have to flag and say, sorry, we probably can't export those.
Right. So where are you exporting that stuff to?
To the U.S.
Right. Okay. So your market is, you telling me you were selling baby products to the Vietnamese market, but you're also selling it to the U.S.?
Yeah. So the way the company evolved in that we started off as a Vietnamese e-commerce company, and, we were fighting tooth and nail here with other retailers, other e-commerce shops. And, at a certain point, it just kind of clicked where we figured, hey, we're from the U.S. If there's a way that we can actually sell in the U.S., like, let's do it. And we can utilize our cost advantages from being here in Saigon. And so, we use a third-party logistics company in the U.S. and, we send out a bunch of inventory. Basically, our workflow here is Adrian and the team are setting up, choosing items. On the buying side, I'll pick the items, and then Adrian sort of takes the rest of the flow and ship them to the U.S. And we'll immediately start trying to get customers online in the U.S.
And how do you test that? Because I imagine, like, if you're not actually, walking the floor, so to speak, going out there and seeing what people want, or seeing people, walking around supermarkets and seeing young mothers and so on, you don't kind of get those insights immediately. How do you know what they want? Are you testing that? Are you doing some kind of online testing? Or how do you get a gauge for what may work? Because for you, the risk is a lot higher in exporting something, right? Because of time and money, and it's, you have to have a batch to export and so on, even though you have a logistics partner in the US. To take your product to the US is a lot more of a challenge than sort of selling it domestically. So I guess my question is how do you actually test that and know what's wanted before you actually go and do it?
Right. So whenever we're in the U.S., we try to maximize our time there. So we'll do live user testing. So I'll bring back suitcases full of items, and I'll let moms play with them and see which items they gravitate towards. And that's kind of the old-fashioned way we do things. And there are ways to do it with technology where you can kind of measure clicks and like A/B test different items, and we do quite a bit of that too. But we also like to focus on one-on-one user testing to see how moms react.
Right. So give us an example of a product that you source that sells really well in Vietnam and also one that sells well in the US.
I mean, some of the things that Vietnam does well, manufacturing baby clothes. So a lot of times it'll be like a cute dress design. It'll be a design that we see. In the U.S., there are some regional differences between North and South. In the South, smock dresses tend to do better. That they look more like Southern antebellum style, and that seems to do a lot better in the South than it does in the North. And that's something that you'll actually see here in Vietnam as well.
Mm-hmm. And was that something that you just sort of you tested beforehand, or you did the one-on-one?
Oh, that was definitely from user testing.
Right. And how do you actually do that? Do you sort of sit down with them and just sort of let the mom try this stuff, or get the baby to play with stuff? I mean, because I think it's kind of important to get the actual real-world experience, isn't it? Which kind of a lot of people avoid in companies, right? Because talking to customers is a little bit sort of fuzzy, isn't it? And it's a bit random.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes you kind of wonder, is the sample size big enough? Well, one thing that helps is I'm 34 now and I have a 2-year-old baby boy. So my peers that I would grown up with or gone to college or high school with, they're young parents now too. And for the most part, our customers are not always women, but a lot of women in their 30s. We have dads order too, but women in our 30s seem to be our core demographic.
Mm-hmm. How do you know they actually? I mean, you've got a small group of people though, and it's very personal, isn't it? How do you actually know that that's something that's going to sell? Because you could get 3 or 4 people to try something, think, hey, that's really great, but there's the risk there, isn't there, that you could be blindsided because you've got a small sample group.
Yeah. So, I mean, with any buying operation, there's always inventory risk, right? But I think one of the big benefits of being in Vietnam and being close to these factories who are our suppliers, who also do exporting themselves, is we see what's on the line. We see what's being produced before it even hits the U.S. market, right? And so a lot of times what the suppliers are talking about or the trends that they want to try to push here in the Vietnam market are things that they know that they're getting orders for and can sell overseas, right? Other thing is that the company's been around for 4 years, and it's a buying intensive company, and so we basically live and die by our buying, right? And I think a lot of the data points that we've collected, we'll know kind of slowly what items will move, and just because an item moves doesn't mean that it's actually worth selling it, right? And so we take that same idea and we try to apply it to the U.S. So we rely on some kind of auxiliary data. We also listen to what our suppliers are saying, and what people are searching. So we have to read a lot to see what are the trends popping up, what are competitors looking after, and sometimes it's not about just trying to pick up on a macro trend, but just narrowing in and focusing on 1 or 2 items that will do really well.
Mm-hmm. So, Adrian, of the team, you're the one who spends most of your time interfacing with the factories and the manufacturers, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about that process, because I think that's the sort of obviously it's the hidden process in e-commerce and any kind of retail. But of the friends that I have that have set up their own retail businesses, and some of them have set up retail businesses that have gone global, they have always said that it comes down to the suppliers. And I think, retail is quite glamorous. Anything e-commerce is quite glamorous because, you're selling products that people can understand. It's easy to explain. It can touch your life on a daily basis. But it's this thing of going out and working with suppliers, which people don't see, but it's such an important part of the business. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of what you do, especially, with respect to doing that in Vietnam?
So I think that's the best part of the business, actually. Because if that part of the operation goes well, then you're always going to have like a good product. And it's not just suppliers that are reliable in terms of the quality of the product they put out and the deadlines, but it's also their knowledge of why they're producing those items, where they're sourcing those materials. And really, it's just an exercise in relationship building. When Don and I worked at Zalora together, I did private label buying and sourcing for men's apparel at Zalora. And so a lot of the factories and the contacts, that we'll have here, or some of them come from that. And that's where some of my experience comes from. Yeah.
What kind of a person do you have to be successful at that? Because I know you talk about relationships and so on, but what kind of a person? Obviously, you can't be a soft touch, if you're working with suppliers, but at the same time, you can't be the opposite of that. So I'm just curious to know what kind of personality works well in that environment. I
guess you have to be willing to get down and dirty. You have to be willing to go to the factories. You have to be willing to touch the product. I mean, typically, if you want to manage from the office, I know people who have agents and they'll manage that way. It's very difficult because it's an exercise in communication. And anyone who runs a tech business, it's like having your operations team talk to your product team. You guys aren't speaking the same language. And so in order for me to kind of work with the suppliers and get things produced or source products, I have to speak the same language. I need to know what the product specs are. I need to know where they're getting their material. And sometimes, entertain them a bit by helping them. If they're having trouble, finding a certain type of material to produce, then I might even go to another supplier and see if I can source it for them, right? And that's kind of the relationship building and supply chain that ends up being built. And through that, you're able to get like a more reliable product.
And these are all Vietnamese domestic manufacturers, right?
Yeah.
So how does that work out? Because
we actually do know a few people across the border.
Yeah.
We do know.
Sorry, that cut out. Say again.
We actually do have some relationships across the border in Cambodia, and we get inbound inquiries from China quite a bit. So just the entire region is a pretty big factory.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no shortage of potential suppliers. The key is building the relationships. And I'm curious about that because, Don, you may look more like a local than Adrian, and but it'd be pretty obvious pretty quickly that you weren't born in Vietnam, I guess, to a lot of these suppliers, especially when you talk to them. So I'm curious about how that sort of works out, because I know from my experience, when you deal with any kind of incumbent culture, there's always a challenge, isn't it? Because there is always a default position which you can fall to, which becomes the them and us thing. When things go wrong, it's, they're treating me like this because I'm a foreigner, or, I'm a white guy in Asia, or whatever it may be. That's always a challenge, not to sort of snap into that sort of mode. And I guess from their side as well, it can be the same as well. If there's a breakdown of communications, they can all see you as not one of them. Maybe you brought up differently, different way of doing things, different way of talking about things, and so on. So I'm curious about how you actually manage that, because that's such a core part of creating a good relationship, isn't it? And it could easily go so wrong, and that could be the sort of default playing position, right? If become a sticking point between you and the suppliers when it doesn't necessarily have to be. So how do you work that out? How do you ensure that you don't go down that route when you work with suppliers?
I don't think of it so much as a sticking point. I think of it more as a benefit. And one of the ways we stumbled into these relationships is that we would meet with suppliers and we would start speaking, and they would ask me, hey, you sound a little bit funny. Did you grow up somewhere else? And I say, yes, I grew up in the U.S. And they would say, can you help me export to the U.S.?
Interesting. So they already see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, they're business people too. And they know that, we probably have access to wider markets.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms of you being brought up in the US and then coming to Vietnam, how do Vietnamese people generally react to that? I mean, I don't know the culture well enough. Are they sort of curious about you, or are they a little bit suspicious?
Oh, it runs the gamut. Yeah, I mean, it could totally run the gamut in terms of people being very accepting, A lot of people have relatives like me, who grew up overseas, maybe in Germany, Europe, Canada, the U.S., even Japan. So that's actually fairly common because so many people left in the 70s and 80s. In terms of trust, I mean, you always try to be fair with the people that we're working with, and we don't want any hard feelings because we're trying to be long-term greedy here, and we hope that our supplier relationships are, business relationships that we can work with them over decades.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how about with you, Adrian? Is it harder because obviously you don't have a Vietnamese-looking face? So, but maybe that makes it easier for them that they can say, well, obviously you're not a sort of, we don't kind of know whether you're Vietnamese or you're foreign. Obviously you're a foreigner. I'm just working out, how does that work with your suppliers? Is it harder for you to deal with them? Do you find there's a bit more resistance because you're from abroad?
No, I think generally, the Vietnamese suppliers and Vietnamese business people, they love the opportunity to work with foreigners. And so, on appearance-wise, they'll jump at that. And then, if I speak Vietnamese to them, then they're even more excited. It's kind of like entertainment, and so a little bit making their life easier. And so they're often quite excited, right? And it means being able to speak, both languages, like both English and Vietnamese. Sometimes, they want help with products or customers that are English speaking or overseas, and so they'll ask for that as well. So it becomes like a mutual beneficial relationship.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And the fact that you've gone to the effort to learn the language, if what you say is correct and you can negotiate in Vietnamese, I mean, that must, it's a pretty advanced level of language wherever you are in the world, right? And for you to have gone through that effort to do that, for a local person, they feel that, okay, you're stepping into my culture now, therefore I feel a sense of connection with you. So it's not like they don't feel threatened by that, right? Because it's so easy, I guess. I don't know how it is in Ho Chi Minh City, but it's here in Tokyo, and I'm sure it's the same in many other cities in the world. It's so easy to fall into an expat community, isn't it, where you could live there 7 or 8 years and not speak a single word of the language, but you've kind of forced yourself to go out. And how do you actually go about that? Because I think it's great advice for anybody who's moving to these cities. They think about going there to start a business, but, the success and failure of that's going to come down to whether or not they can actually live there, right, rather than the success of the business.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think these days it's a lot easier to kind of put yourself in the expat community. But, when 7 years ago, 10 years ago, there were expats here, but there weren't any places that a lot of expats really congregated, right? And so you're kind of forced to be out and just meet a lot of different people. I think, when I came back for long-term wise and started working at Zalora, it was simple. It's, I'm here to build relationships. I'm here to kind of produce these products and get into business. And so, find all the groups and the personalities that we need to meet to make that happen, regardless of where they're from, right? But again, whenever you're dealing with business in Vietnam, it's best to have a lot of strong local relationships, because they also have their own relationships, and those go a lot further. There's also a risk factor when you talk about expats, because there's always the idea that in a week or two or in the next year or the next 2 years, they could just up and leave. Right. And so having, strong local relationships is really what takes you too far. And that's not even touching the language issue. I think the language issue makes that easier. Right. Mm-hmm. I think naturally by speaking the language that you're able to connect to people that may not have, expat friends. And so it's easier to kind of spend time with them and get to know them, their families, and their other associates.
Yeah, sure. And your boy, Don, 2 years old, you said?
That's right.
Right.
His name is Graham.
And his name is Graham. Thank you. So what's in terms of what he's going to speak in the household, is it going to be Vietnamese or English?
Right now, he seems stronger in Vietnamese.
Right. But that's because it's around him all the time, right?
Yeah. So my wife and I have been very diligent about speaking English to him, but he notices us speak Vietnamese to our staff, and he also notices Adrian speak Vietnamese to other people.
Yeah, I speak Vietnamese too.
Right, and so his babies are smart in that way, I guess. They will notice what language adults are speaking to each other, and I think he takes that as a cue.
Yeah. But he would have been exposed to English as well. So even if, Vietnamese was his dominant language, for him to pick up English and speak as a native is going to be straightforward, right? Because he's got all the sounds in his head, which sort of impressed upon at an early age, right? Which is always harder when you're older trying to start a new language because you can't get those sounds in your head, right?
Right. That's the hope.
That is the hope, but it's fine. It's just interesting because you're living in that world. Do you think that you would then want him to grow up in America, or do you think by the time that he grows up, that Vietnam would be a default choice for somebody like him, a young guy in Vietnam growing up? The opportunities there. What do you think?
Oh, we just want him to have the choice to go wherever he wants. We think that Vietnam is going to be a rich country in our lifetime, and that my son's going to have a lot of opportunities here. The U.S. is still a super dynamic place, and we do business in both the U.S. and Vietnam, and we hope he's going to be able to have one foot in either country whenever he wants.
Right. So in 2033, he'll be, 18? Yeah, that'll be right. He'll be 18, so he'll be a man in 2033. What is Vietnam going to look like then?
Well, I'm thinking more about what Saigon's going to look like. I think the infrastructure is going to be a lot better, and hopefully it'll be less polluted.
Yeah. I mean, some people have commented that Korea in the the late 80s and the early 90s is what Vietnam looks like today, right? People have said that Taiwan as well in Taipei. So, if those are any clues into what's going to happen in terms of development, then, in 16 more years, then it's going to be a bigger market. There's going to be a lot more flow of like products coming in and going out. There's probably a lot of the government regulations will also have changed as well, right? And then urban infrastructure, which makes the city kind of glimmer and glam. That's going to be like more or less people looking at Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. So if I was a young entrepreneur now and I wanted to get my foothold in Asia, I mean, some of the places I've mentioned already are sort of the default obvious choices. If I was sort of a location-independent entrepreneur, I might go to Thailand. I may go to Singapore if I want to do that sort of corporate thing. Why would I choose Vietnam? And importantly, sort of looking forward as well, that sort of new next generation of entrepreneurs who may be graduating and getting started in the US, who may want to go and sample the future, what would be the real draw for somebody like that? What would be the sort of the case that would sell it to somebody to come to Saigon, particularly,
right,
over the other cities?
So don't come here and compete against us.
All right, you've established that, so those guys are out, right?
What would be the draw? I think, people always come and go in Vietnam, and I think there's not as many people staying here for like the long haul. And if you think about it from a perspective of culture, if you think about it from a perspective of language, a lot of that's still relatively untouched territory, right? And so if someone says, hey, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, and they enjoy that challenge to kind of discover and create something new for themselves, where the market is not dictating as much. Here, the market doesn't dictate as much as, let's say, other places like Singapore or let's say Hong Kong, right? And so if someone says, hey, I have a new idea and I want to test it out, that's relatively, a place where my operations costs don't have to be high. I can recruit great talent, and the people here are hungry, right? They want to create something for themselves. And so it's great to find, it's easy to find great partners or great people that you're able to work with. And so I think that's a huge appeal.
Right. On that note, do you find it easier to get things done as an entrepreneur?
I think it depends. With the right team, yes. But in terms of red tape and kind of on the regulatory side, it can be difficult. But, once you figure it out, then it feels, a lot easier.
Right. And that's going to change. That's going to improve, isn't it? Because, Vietnam is growing up, essentially. And, to grow up, it has to go through a number of hurdles, clear a number of hurdles to get to the kind of stage where Singapore or Hong Kong is, right? And that's not going to start with necessarily removing all the red tape. That sort of comes over time, isn't it? But that gets better. If you're looking around the region, if you look at what's happening, it's all sort of heading in the right direction when it comes to bureaucracy and supporting entrepreneurship. And I think that's one of the things that challenges people, who have only ever known life in Europe or life in the US, right, is that they kind of assume that is the bastion of entrepreneurship. If you're going to start a business, you've got to do it there because that's the free world, if I can use it quote unquote, whereas Asia is sort of still a developing market. But I think people are constantly surprised, aren't they, when they come to Asia and see how things are done, especially how they've changed in the last 5 or 10 years at least, and how pro-entrepreneurship they are, and how things are really sort of moving in the right direction. If you're an entrepreneur, it's a great place to be because there's that sort of can-do attitude. So, Don, Adrian, it's great speaking to you. A real pleasure having you on the show. Before I let you go, I want you to share with us some links so the listeners can find out a bit more about you.
Sure. Our company is Embe.co. It's EMBE.co. And so if you're in the U.S., you can order baby clothes and other items from us.
Fantastic. And personally, where can they find out more about your stories? Do you have anything out there that they can go and check out?
I think if you Google Don Kim Phan, you're gonna find out a lot. If you Google my name, you'll find out some stuff. We've upped our SEO game personally.
We should write more about us on the site. Yeah.
Our LinkedIn's. I don't even know my link.
All right. We could put all the details in the show notes.
Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Gentlemen, loved having you on the show. Thank you for sharing your story and sharing with us your journey to getting to Vietnam and also things at Embe and also, how things are going there. Wish you all the best with that. It would be great to keep a close eye on how you're doing with that journey, and in the future, you've got new developments, new news about your progress, about Embe and so on, please come back on the show and share it with us.
Great, we'd love to. Let us know when you're in Saigon.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.